Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audiobooks, ranging from bestsellers to celebrity memoirs, news, business, and self-development. Every month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, and access to daily news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, as well as guided meditation programs. Between a full-time job in IT and a full-time job in podcasting, it gets harder and harder to sit down and read the books I'm interested in. This is where Audible comes in. I can listen on my daily commute, relaxing, or while out running errands and still get in the books I've been wanting to get into. You can download titles and listen offline anytime, anywhere. The app is free and can be installed on all smartphones and tablets. Now you can try Audible risk-free with a special 30-day free trial by visiting audibletrial.com/nerdery and murdery. That's audibletrial.com/nerdery and murdery. Don't let your busy life get in the way of that great book you've been wanting to read. Go get your free trial of Audible today. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. This is Geoffrey, and we've talked about many times before that I experience problems and struggles with my mental health, and really without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is therapy does work. It's helped for me, but what is therapy exactly? It's whatever you want it to be. Maybe you're not feeling motivated right now and would like some tools to help. Or maybe you're feeling insecure in relationships at work, or you're not dealing well with stress. Whatever you need, it's really time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles, and it's time to start feeling better because you deserve to be happy. And now you don't have to worry about finding an in-person therapist near you to help. BetterHelp is a customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and you can start communicating with your therapist in under 48 hours. So join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are your greatest asset. And there's a special offer to Nerdery and Murdery listeners. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/nerdery and murdery. That's betterhelp.com/nerdery and murdery. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast.
Tin the tail Tweeny Todd. His skin was pale, his eyes was odd. He shaved the face of gentlemen who never were heard of again. He trod the path a few have trod. Did Sweeney Todd, the demon Barbara Feet Street.
You're an idiot. Welcome to episode 90 of Nerdery and Murdery.
Big 90. I'm Zig with your nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your murdery. So, Zig, I think you have another nerdery subject for us to cover today, so I will let you take it over.
Yes, I do. It's about Stephen Sondheim.
All right.
Stephen Sondheim was an American composer and lyricist, one of the most important figures in the 20th century musical theater. Sondheim was credited for having reinvented the American musical with shows that tackled unexpected themes that ranged far beyond the genre's traditional subjects. With music and lyrics of unprecedented complexity and sophistication, his shows addressed darker, more harrowing elements of the human experience, with songs often tinged with ambivalence about various aspects of life. He was known for his frequent collaborations with Hal Prince, James Lapine of the Broadway stage. So, Stephen Sondheim is known for a few things. West Side Story, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Into the Woods, and his reimagining of West Side Story, where he put the dirty words back in.
And Into the Woods is the only one I've seen.
You've never seen Sweeney Todd?
Uh-uh.
All right, so let me paint a picture for you. The first 3 rows of what they call a true Sweeney Todd show are like the first 3 rows of a Gallagher show.
Okay.
You're going to get stage blood on you. They have another type of production called Teeny Todd, where they don't squirt it into the audience. They just squirt it on the stage.
Mm-hmm.
But a true, full Sweeney Todd, yeah, when he goes to shave the people and slice their throats, little jets of stage blood go out into the first 3 rows of the audience.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Because Stephen Sondheim isn't jacking around. Sondheim's interest in musical theater began at a young age and was mentored by Oscar Hammerstein II. He began his career by writing the lyrics for West Side Story, which is not bad, and Gypsy. He transitioned to writing both music and lyrics for the theater, with his best-known works including A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, which is incredible if you've never seen it, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Merrily We Roll Along, Sunday in the Park with George, and Into the Woods. Stephen Sondheim also passed away November of last year. 1930 to 2021. So he had a nice long run.
Yes, he did.
And he was still working that West Side Story that they just re-released, where they put all the dirty words back in it. That was released last year, so he was still working.
Right.
Because West Side Story originally, when he wrote it, was supposed to be rough. It was supposed to talk about gangs on the street, with sex and violence and everything else. And when they put it on the Broadway stage, actually, when they put it on off Broadway, it was still like that. When they brought it to Broadway, they cleaned it up. When they brought it to the movies, they really cleaned it up. So the 2021 production of West Side Story is actually closer to what it was originally supposed to be. Gypsy, about famed burlesque star Gypsy Rose Lee, is also an incredible show with a lot of great music. A Little Night Music has probably one of the saddest songs I've ever heard. When I was a young man, I was able to hear one of our local heroes, Betty Bob Buckley, sing Send in the Clowns to a house full of people for 2 weeks straight every night. And I can tell you, when that song is sung properly, it should bring a tear to your eye, because it's written that way. It's written to tug at your heartstrings, and it does, again, when it's sung properly. Sondheim's numerous accolades include 8 Tony Awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Tony, an Academy Award, 8 Grammy Awards, a Laurence Olivier Award, a Pulitzer Prize, a Kennedy Center Honor, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's an Emmy away from a PGOT, but I don't think he ever did anything for television. He has a theater named for him on Broadway, as well as the West End in London. Film adaptations of his work include West Side Story, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which is a farce, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Into the Woods, and West Side Story. So a little background on Sondheim himself. He was born on March 22nd, 1930, into a Jewish family in New York City, the son of Etta Janet Fox and Herbert Sondheim. His paternal grandparents, Isaac and Rosa, were German Jews, and his maternal grandparents, Joseph and Bessie, were Lithuanian. His father manufactured dresses designed by his mother. The composer grew up in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And you can kind of hear that. There's a lot of Upper West Side Borscht Belt in his phrasing. Think like Henny Youngman,
mm-hmm.
or Jerry Lewis when he speaks. There's a cadence to that speech, that is quintessentially Jewish Upper West Side, and it's brilliant, it's funny, and the cadence kind of draws you in. I think because of its lyrical quality. He was described in Merle Secret's biography as isolated and emotionally neglected as a child when he lived in New York City. Sondheim also attended the ethical culture Fieldstone School, and he spent several summers at Camp Androscoggin. His mother sent him to New York Military Academy in 1940, and from 42 to 47, he attended George School, a private Quaker preparatory school in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where he wrote his first musical, By George, in 1946. From 46 to 50, Sondheim attended Williams College. He graduated magna cum laude and received the Hubbard Hutchinson Prize and a 2-year fellowship to study music. Sondheim traced his interest in the theater to a production of Very Warm for May, a Broadway musical he saw when he was 9. The curtains went up and revealed a piano. Sondheim recalled a butler took a duster and brushed it up, tinkling the keys, and he thought it was thrilling. When Sondheim was about 10 years old, his parents got divorced, but he formed a close friendship with James Hammerstein, son of lyricist and playwright Oscar Hammerstein II. And they were neighbors in Bucks County. The elder Hammerstein became Sondheim's surrogate father and influenced him profoundly and developed his love of musical theater. Sondheim met Hal Prince, who would later direct many of his shows at the opening of South Pacific that Hammersmith did with Richard Rodgers. The comic musical he wrote at George School, By George, was a success among his peers and buoyed the young songwriter's self-esteem. When Sondheim asked Hammerstein to evaluate it, he thought he had no knowledge of its author. He said it was the worst thing he'd ever seen. Wow. But if you want to know why it's terrible, I'll tell you. They spent the rest of the day going over the musical, and Sondheim later said, in that afternoon, I learned more about songwriting and musical theater than most people learn in a lifetime. Well, you think about it. Oscar Hammerstein II was a very successful musician and lyricist for Broadway musicals.
Right.
As well as his father, the original Oscar Hammerstein, and he said, this is awful, but I'm going to tell you why it's awful, and how you can improve it. And he did. Based on a play he admired, Sondheim chose George F. Kaufman and Mark Connolly's Beggars on Horseback, which became All That Glitters. Based on a play he liked but thought flawed, Sondheim chose Maxwell Anderson's High Tour. Based on an existing novel of short stories not previously dramatized, which became his unfinished version of Mary Poppins, unrelated to the musical film of the stage plays. So that's what he was working on when he was studying music right out of college.
Mm-hmm.
But none of those got produced professionally. They eventually did get produced, but it was years later after he'd gone on to do other stuff. Then in 1960, Oscar Hammerstein II died of stomach cancer at the age of 65. Sondheim later recalled that Hammerstein had given him a portrait of himself. Sondheim asked him to inscribe it and said later about the request that it was weird. It's like asking your father to inscribe something. But reading the inscription, for Stevie, my friend and teacher, choked up the composer, who said, that describes Oscar better than anything I could say. So he didn't get along well in college. Everybody said he was real dry and thought he was wonderful because he was very dry. But it had a tendency to give him trouble with his peers. He wanted to study composition and theory and harmony without attending musicology. But he wasn't able to do that till he got into grad school. And that's when he decided he wanted to do musical theater. I think he'd actually decided that, when he was 9 years old the first time he saw it, but he really took a professional leap at that point. He met a gentleman by the name of Milton Babbitt, and they were working on music for Mary Martin based on the myth of Helen of Troy. And they would meet once a week in New York City for 4 hours because Babbitt was teaching at Princeton at the time. According to Sondheim, they spent the first hour dissecting Rodgers and Hart or George Gershwin and studied Babbitt's favorite music, Buddy DeSilva, Lou Brown, and Ray Henderson, all jazz guys. They then proceeded to other forms of music, such as Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, critiquing them the same way. Babbitt and Sondheim, fascinated by mathematics and music, studied songs by various composers like Jerome Kern. And Sondheim was fascinated with Kern with his ability to develop a single motif through tiny variations in a long and never boring line. So that's kind of what set Sondheim off on the way he wrote songs. If you've ever heard Stephen Sondheim stuff, again, like Into the Woods, you notice he will have these really, really long lyrics, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Real hard to sing because it's hard to take breaths in between there. You have to take breaths without anybody knowing. But normally when in musicals that they do that in, especially back in the early 30s and 40s, they'd have those long exposition lyrics and they'd be the most forgettable piece in the musical, right?
Right.
With like Rodgers and Hart or Hammerstein. They'd have these real long lyrics and they'd sound phony, So Sondheim studied some of these composers and things and tried to figure out how to get those long lines of exposition into a musical and have them still sound interesting. And the way he figured that out was you change the tone of the music as the line goes on, which is how you get like the opening thing and change the emphasis, which is why it's not Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. It's Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. See, it's more interesting when you frame it that way. Yeah. Because I just said Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, meh, but it has to have that long punch and then quick exposition and then a pause. Almost too long, because it's almost too long. And then the big punch at the end. It makes the phrasing interesting. So that's basically what Sondheim was crunching on at this time. But by the age of 22, Sondheim had finished four shows that were requested by Hammerstein, screenwriters Julius and Philip Epstein, Front Porch and Flatbush, which was never produced. And he was shopped around by designers and producer Lemuel Ayres. Ayres approached Frank Loesser and another composer who both turned him down. Ayres and Sondheim met as ushers at a wedding, and Ayres commissioned Sondheim for 3 songs for the show, Julius Epstein. Then flew in from California and hired Sondheim, who worked with him in California for 4 or 5 months. They eventually titled the show they were working on Saturday Night, and it was intended to open during the 54/55 Broadway season. However, Ayres died of leukemia in his early 40s, and the production rights transferred to his widow, Shirley, and due to her inexperience, the show did not continue as planned. It finally opened off Broadway in 2000, and it was kind of a hit because it was early Sondheim. And then he, of course, he did some work on West Side Story, but where he really, really shined the first time, where people knew his name, was when he did A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. It's a musical with music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim. The book was by Bert Shevlov and Gary Gelbart. And it's inspired by farces of the ancient Roman playwright Plautus. So he basically wrote a farce that takes place in ancient Rome as a musical. And it opened on Broadway on May 8th, 1962 at the Alvin Theater, and then transferred to the Mark Hellinger Theater and then the Majestic Theater, where the show closed on August 29th, 1964, after 964 performances and 8 previews.
Wow.
So that bad boy ran for a little over 2 years. You know, a show a night, 2 shows on Saturday, 2 shows on Sunday. Both Zero Mostel and Glifford then went on to recreate the Broadway roles for the 1966 musical film directed by Richard Lester. Leon Green reprises his West End role of Miles Gloriosus, and Phil Silvers portrayed Lysias. Michael Crawford played the hero, and Michael Hordern played Synex. Buster Keaton made his final film appearance in the role of Erroneous. In the film, a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. If you've never seen it, it is, well, we talked about it in the farce episode. It's an incredible farce. The film is not as music heavy as the musical itself. There are a couple of great tunes in it, but for the most part, it's just a rip-roaring farce set in ancient Rome, and really funny. And Buster Keaton is hysterical. You know, we always think of him as the silent era clown, but what most people don't realize is Buster Keaton had a very funny voice and was very funny at speaking, you know, because he started out as a comedian. Funny guy, and he's really funny in this. Now, after this, of course, he was doing West Side Story, which, again, he got quite a few accolades for, but it's not really, West Side Story really wasn't Stephen Sondheim yet, and I think it's because they cleaned it up a little bit. But he went on to do A Little Night Music. And it's a musical with music and lyrics, again, by Stephen Sondheim, and book by Hugh Wheeler. And it's inspired by the 1955 Ingmar Bergman film Smiles of a Summer Night. It involves the romantic lives of several couples. Its title is a literal English translation of the German name for Mozart's Serenade number 13K 525, Ein kleine Nachtmusik, which is a little night music. The musical includes the popular song Send in the Clowns, and it was written for Glynis Johns. And again, Send in the Clowns is quite possibly the most beautiful song I've ever heard in a musical. And again, it has to be sung properly, because I've heard it sung not so properly and it's not great. It's still a good song, but it should tug at your heartstrings. I want to say they played it on the radio too, the Glynis Johns version. And since its original 1973 Broadway production, the musical has enjoyed professional productions in the West End by opera companies. Again, because you really kind of need strong singers for this one. In a 2009 Broadway revival and elsewhere, and as popular choice for regional groups. It was adapted for a film in 1977 with Harold Prince directing and Elizabeth Taylor, Lynn Carew, Leslie Ann Down, and Diana Riggs starring. I love Diana Riggs and Elizabeth Taylor. The reason you never heard of A Little Night Music film is because they're not strong enough singers to sing it, to pull it off. Opera companies do this show. But again, if you ever get a chance to see A Little Night Music live, it's a good musical. It takes place around these couples going off to the countryside in England in the late 19th, early 20th century. So it's about English aristocrats, but it's funny and interesting. It's set in Sweden. Around the year 1900, and one by one, there's a quintet of 5 singers who comment like a Greek chorus throughout the show. Either turning up gradually, the vocalizings become an overture, blending fragments of Remember, Soon, and The Glamorous Life, leading into the first night waltz. The other characters enter in waltzing, each uncomfortable with their partner after they drift back off, and again the sardonic Madame Armfeldt, a wealthy former courtesan, and her solemn granddaughter, Frederica, enter. Madame And Armfeld tells the child that the summer night smiles 3 times. First to the young, second on fools, and third on the old. Frederica vows to watch the smiles occur. Middle-aged, successful lawyer Frederick Ingerman has recently married an 18-year-old trophy wife, Anne, a naive girl who loves Frederick but isn't attracted to him. And the two have been married for 11 months, and Anne still protects her virginity. Frederick plots now he might seduce his wife. Meanwhile, his son Heinrich, a seminary student a year older than his stepmother, is frustrated and ignored. Anne promises her husband that shortly she will consent to having sex, even though she can't help recoiling at his touch soon, which leads into all 3 of them lamenting at once. Anne's missing maidservant Petra, an inexperienced and forthright girl slightly older than the teen herself, offers her worldly but crass advice. So all of this is going on while this Greek chorus is singing, remember, and then there's some more of them singing soon, and some more singing the glamorous life. So all this is going on while this in the background, while these people are dancing and talking to one another. So again, it's very Greek. It's like a Greek chorus, which is how they used to do the shows. There'd be people singing and there'd be people acting out in front of the singers. So Sin and the Clowns, which is a part of A Little Night Music, was a song written by Stephen Sondheim for the 1973 musical A Little Night Music and adapted from Ingmar Bergman's Smiles of Summer Night. It's a ballad from the second act, in which the character Desiree, another one of the couples that comes out dancing at the opening, reflects of the ironies and disappointments of her life. Among other things, she looks back on an affair years earlier with the lawyer Frederick, who was deeply in love with her, but whose marriage proposal she had rejected. Meeting him after so long, she realizes she's in love with him and finally ready to marry him. But now it's he who rejects her. He is in an unconsummated marriage with a much younger woman. Desiree proposes marriage to rescue him from the situation, but he declines, citing his dedication to his bride. Reaction to his rejection, Desiree sings the song. The song is later reprised as a coda after Frederick's young wife runs away with his son, and Frederick is finally free to accept Desiree's offer. And that's where this kind of boils up. But again, there's a lot of turn of the century costuming in this. I've seen this both in a proscenium stage and in the round. It's beautiful. It's just beautifully produced. So if you're out there, if you ever get a chance to see the musical A Little Night Music, it's definitely one you want to try. The next one I want to discuss is Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, often referred to as Sweeney Todd. It was a musical play with music and lyrics by Stephen Sondheim and a book by Hugh Wheeler. It's based on the 1973 play of the same name by Christopher Bond. The character Sweeney Todd first appears in a Victorian penny dreadful titled The String of Pearls. Sweeney Todd opened on Broadway in 1979 and West End in 1980. It won the Tony Award for Best Musical and the Olivier Award for Best New Musical. It's been revived in many productions as well as inspiring a film adaptation. The original logo for the music is a modified version of the advertisement image from the 19th century, with the sign replaced by a straight razor. There's also a woman wearing a bloodstained dress and holding a rolling pin next to the man. So the character of Sweeney Todd originated in a serialized Victorian popular fiction known as a penny dreadful. The story called The String of Pearls was published in a weekly magazine during the winter of 1846 to 1847. So that's where the story goes, back to. It's a principal villain, a certain Sweeney Todd, and includes all the plot elements used in later versions. So basically how this plays out. Sweeney Todd went up against this judge when he was younger, who coveted Sweeney Todd's wife. The judge killed Sweeney Todd's wife and framed Sweeney Todd for her murder and sent him to a penal colony and then raised Sweeney Todd's daughter as his own. The story takes place 20 years later when Sweeney Todd comes back and opens a barber shop above a meat pie shop. Sweeney Todd is vowed to get revenge on not only the judge, but everybody else who helped him carry out his evil deeds. So he invites people up. He gives them a shave. He has disguised himself, so no one recognizes him. Gives them a shave, kills them, and then he deposits the body into the lower section of the meat pie shop where they turn them into meat pies. The meat pies become the biggest selling thing in London. So it's about murder, revenge, and cannibalism.
Gross.
But it's a fun romp. It's had by all. And Sweeney Todd eventually saves his daughter. His daughter runs off with a young man, and Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Miggins get caught up in their whole evil schemes. But again, it's dark, it's funny, and in the original Broadway production, when he goes to slice their throat, squirts blood into the audience. Most people who produce it do a thing called what they call a teeny Todd, where it doesn't do that. But there's a lot of people who really are down for the full experience, as it were. So if you ever go to see Sweeney Todd and it's a full production in the theaters, don't wear white. Just don't do it. It's just food coloring. Well, it's corn syrup, water, and food coloring. But it will stain white clothes. So wear dark clothes if you go out to see it. But it's still a lot of fun. Sweeney Todd's mental collapse and the subsequent plan for I'm sorry, I said Mrs. Miggins. It's Mrs. Lovett's meat pies. So sorry. Takes place in less than half a page of dialogue, much too quickly to convey the full psychological impact. A scholar, Larry A. Brown, said Sondheim's version more carefully reveals the developed ideas in Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett's demented mind. A lot of people have compared it to the Grand Guignol in France, which was a theater that produced basically blood and gore plays, because that's what the people of France wanted. But Stephen Sondheim said it has nothing to do with the Grand Guignol. He wanted it to kind of more mirror the Industrial Revolution of, Upton Sinclair's The Concrete Jungle, of people getting ground up into sausages, that sort of thing. And it, to my mind, having seen it, it does kind of convey that. On the stage of the Uris Theater in New York, the tale of Horus was transformed into a mountain of steel in motion. Prince's scenic metaphor for Sweeney Todd was a 19th century iron foundry moved from Rhode Island and reassembled on the stage. When it came to casting, originally Sondheim thought the stage version Angela Lansbury would add some needed comedy to the grim take of the lunatic Cockney shopkeeper, and he was right. The pie shop lady really does need to be funny. Because the film version that they made with Johnny Depp and oh my God, what is her name? Bellatrix Lestrange. Helena Bonham Carter.
Yes.
Helena Bonham Carter is too serious for that role, so it doesn't play right. Of course, they weren't really doing a musical, so it was kind of a musical, the Sweeney Todd movie, but I think they left some stuff out. One of the things was Helena Bonham Carter took that role too seriously. You need somebody funny. You need an Angela Lansbury. And she did originate that role on Broadway. I believe I've got some scenes from the Broadway, because they recorded it back in the early 80s. I've got some scenes from that in our YouTube playlist. So kind of in wrapping up Sondheim, I wanted to kind of talk about a couple of those things. Musical theater was dying in America in the 60s and 70s, right? Well, not so much the 60s, but in the 70s. people stopped going to Broadway. And it was only because of the things that Stephen Sondheim was doing that brought them back in. And it made it kind of what it is today. I would say Stephen Sondheim and Andrew Lloyd Webber. But Andrew Lloyd Webber stuff was more being produced in the West End in London and then getting shown over here after. Whereas with Sondheim, it was the other way around. But yeah, those two guys were bringing the heat. But, and I will say this, Stephen Sondheim's stuff is original. Andrew Lloyd Webber's is not. Andrew Lloyd Webber, you can tell he was influenced by Pink Floyd and The Who just by listening to his version of The Phantom of the Opera.
Right.
Yeah. Metal, Echoes, Tommy. There's a lot of the musical lines that were just outright stolen. Sondheim doesn't do that. Sondheim takes some ideas. He's like, I'm going to take some idea from old Greek tragedies here. I'm going to take some ideas from 1930s or 1920s vaudeville and put it in here. We're going to do some farce. We're going to have these gangs get into these fights. That's going to look like dances. You know, yeah, we're going to take the Wicked Witch of the West and turn that idea on its ear and Into the Woods. You know, that's just how that dude operated and did for a long time. 90. I think he died when he was 90. No, I'm sorry, 91. You know, he was incredible. Stephen Sondheim was incredible, and he basically kept Broadway alive for 30 years. He's just somebody that I don't want to say he gets forgotten because all the theater kids know who Stephen Sondheim is. You know, he's like Neil Simon. But if you like musicals, and generally when people talk about liking musicals, what they say is, oh, I love West Side Story, or oh, I love Sweeney Todd. They're all talking about Stephen Sondheim. They're not talking about Rodgers and Hart or Rodgers and Hammerstein. There's nothing wrong with Rodgers and Hart and Rodgers and Hammerstein, but they're from a bygone era. Stephen Sondheim writes stuff for the late 20th and early 21st century. But that's about it for him other than get out and see him. He has a much larger body of work. There's way too much to list, but Gypsy, Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Follies, A Little Night Music, Sweeney Todd, Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods, and, you know, West Side Story. But again, West Side Story always seemed a little cleaned up to me. It wasn't until a few years ago that I realized that it was cleaned up. That Sondheim basically, some of the guts got taken out of that before they put it on Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see the new version of it. I think that's the one they've got on HBO Max. I think that's it. Or was it Disney? Anyway, somebody's produced it and actually put it on television, so you can go out and watch it. But yeah, that's Stephen Sondheim in a nutshell.
Nice. I appreciate that. I'm familiar with his musicals. Like I said, only having seen Into the Woods. Miranda actually did a production of that in high school, so that's where I saw it.
It's a good show. It's a good show for high school kids too.
Yeah.
That's another thing about Sondheim. Other people could pick this show up and do it. The same with The Funny Thing Happened to the Way. Best version of The Funny Thing Happened to the Way of the Forum I saw at a high school theater convention. These kids did a 2.5 hour production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. That was the funniest thing I've ever seen live.
That's great.
Kids. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for that trip into musicals. So hopefully people will get interested and decide to go see it for themselves.
If nothing else, find a good copy of Send in the Clowns and listen to it. It is so beautiful.
Awesome. Well, with that, I guess we will move over to the murdery side of the house.
Murder.
For today, I got my information off All That's Interesting, Britannica, and Wikipedia, and this is the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
The Night Stalker.
And I'm assuming you're familiar with the name at least.
Oh, yeah.
Don't know how much of the story you're familiar with, but so born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, serial killer Richard Ramirez became infamous as the Night Stalker after killing 14 people between 1984 and 1985.
Yep.
He was convicted and sentenced to death, but died while in prison. And he used a wide variety of weapons and different murder methods, including handguns, various types of knives, a machete, a tire iron, and a claw hammer. He punched, pistol whipped, and strangled many of his victims, both with his hands and, in one instance, a ligature, stomped at least one victim to death in her sleep, and tortured another victim by shocking her with a live electrical cord. Ramirez also enjoyed frequently degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided not to kill by forcing them to profess that they love Satan, or telling them to swear on Satan if there were no more valuables left in their home he had broken into and burglarized. On August 31st, 1985, serial killer Richard Ramirez walked into a convenience store in Los Angeles. At first, the man known as the Night Stalker seemed like an ordinary shopper, but then he noticed his own face on the cover of the newspaper and he ran for his life. At that point, Richard Ramirez was already considered the main suspect in the brutal Night Stalker murders that had terrorized California for over a year, but authorities had only just released his name and picture to the public. This gave residents plenty of time to memorize his physical features and point him out to authorities as he dashed out the store. It also gave Ramirez very little chance to get away, but of course he tried to escape. The ensuing chase involved 7 police cars and a helicopter that tracked Ramirez through the city, but an angry mob of bystanders caught up to him first. Enraged by his heinous crimes, they began to beat him relentlessly, and at least one man used a metal pipe. By the time police arrived, Ramirez was practically thanking them for arresting him.
Didn't a news helicopter capture this?
Yes.
Yes, because I think I've seen this. It was like, uh-oh.
Yeah. The Night Stalker had begun his brutal killing spree a little over a year before his arrest, and in that time, Richard Ramirez murdered at least 14 people, as we said before, and committed countless crimes and other violent acts. But his life of crime started long before that. Born on February 29, 1960, Richard Ramirez was raised in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children born of Mexican immigrants. Ramirez claimed that his father physically abused him, that he sustained multiple head injuries at an early age. One injury was so severe that it reportedly caused him to have epileptic seizures. To escape his violent father, Ramirez spent a lot of time with his older cousin Miguel, who was a Vietnam veteran, and unfortunately Miguel's influence wasn't that much better than his father's had been. During his time in Vietnam, Miguel had raped, tortured, and even dismembered several Vietnamese women, and sickeningly, he had photographic evidence to prove it. He often showed Little Richie photos of the horrors he inflicted upon the women, and Richard would later state while incarcerated that he was fascinated rather than repulsed by the images and stories that Mike shared with him. And when
I think I heard about the cousin before too.
Mm-hmm.
This seems familiar. Yeah, but the cousin was just as bad of a dude.
Well, and when Ramirez was just 13 years old, he witnessed his cousin fatally shoot his own wife in the face during a domestic argument. Like the graphic photos and stories of his cousin's war crime in Vietnam, Ramirez would later similarly remark that witnessing the murder was not traumatic for him in any traditional sense, but rather a subject of fascination. Shortly after the shooting, Ramirez began to transform from a scared, abused boy to a hardened, sullen young man. Shortly after the shooting, Richard moved in with his older sister, Ruth, and her husband, Roberto, an obsessive peeping Tom who took Richard along on his nocturnal exploits. After Miguel was released from the mental hospital in 1977, he sometimes accompanied Richard and Roberto on these voyeuristic walks, spying on women in the nearby areas through their windows. By the time Richard had turned 14 in early 1974, he began using LSD frequently. He and Mike resumed bonding over their shared use of drugs and alcohol, and it was during this period that Richard began to cultivate an interest in Satanism and the occult. From developing an interest in Satanism to becoming addicted to drugs, Ramirez's life took a dark turn, And even worse, he was still under his cousin's influence, since Miguel had not been found guilty of the murder by reason of insanity. Miguel ultimately just spent 4 years in a mental hospital until he was released. When he reached adolescence, Richard Ramirez began to meld his burgeoning sexual fantasies with graphic violence, including forced bondage, BDSM, murder, mutilation, and rape. While still in school, he took a job at a local Holiday Inn and used his passkey to rob sleeping patrons. On at least one occasion, Ramirez molested 2 children in an elevator at a hotel, but he was never reported or prosecuted for this act. His employment ended abruptly after Ramirez attempted to rape a woman in her hotel room and was caught in the act by the victim's husband. Although the husband beat Ramirez at the scene, criminal charges were dropped when the couple who lived out of state declined to return to Texas to testify against him. By the time he left his home in Texas and moved to California at the age of 22, he'd begun frequently using cocaine. Ramirez would often commit burglaries to support his drug addiction, many of which were later accompanied by murders, attempted murders, rapes, and assaults. Before long, Ramirez developed an obsession with the same kinds of sexual and physical violence that Miguel had inflicted on women in his photos. And Ramirez also began to have more run-ins with the law, especially after he moved to the Los Angeles area in California. Around this time, Ramirez began breaking into homes, and after dropping out of high school, he moved to Los Angeles, where he continued to commit his crimes and was briefly imprisoned for stealing a car. Though most of his early crimes were in the late 1970s and early 1980s were related to theft and drug possession, it would only be a matter of time before they escalated to unspeakable violence. For a long time, Ramirez's first murder was believed to have taken place on June 28, 1984. It was then that he killed 79-year-old Jenny Vincow. Not only did Ramirez stab and sexually assault his victim, he also slashed her throat so deeply that she was nearly decapitated.
Oh, my God.
Ramirez's fingerprint was found on a mesh screen he removed to gain access through an open window. And this, Ramirez's second known murder, established his pattern of breaking into homes, committing particularly vicious murders, and frequently burglarizing his victims either before or after killing them, which was mainly to support his cocaine addiction and pay his rent.
Wait a minute. So, on his first murder, they pulled a print.
Mm-hmm.
And he had already been in jail? So they had his fingerprints on record?
Yes.
Why they didn't pick him up the first time?
Well, decades after Ramirez was arrested in 1985, he was also linked by DNA evidence to the murder of a 9-year-old girl, which took place on April 10th, 1984, months before the Vincow murder.
Oh, wow.
So that may have been his first killing, unless there was more that happened before that. So we're not really sure on what his first killing was.
Okay.
On April 10th, 1984, Ramirez murdered Mei Lung, a 9-year-old Chinese-American girl, in the basement of his apartment building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Lung was with her 8-year-old brother and looking for a lost $1 bill when Ramirez approached the girl and told her to follow him into the basement to find it. Once they were in the basement, Ramirez beat, strangled, and raped Lung before stabbing her to death with a switchblade, hanging her partially nude body from a pipe by her blouse.
Oh, my God.
On March 17, 1985, Ramirez's murder spree began in earnest with an assault on Maria Hernandez in her home. Though Hernandez managed to escape, her roommate Dale Okasaki was not so lucky. Hernandez survived when the bullet ricocheted off the keys she held in her hands as she lifted them to protect herself, and Hernandez played dead until Ramirez left the scene. Inside the house, her roommate Dale, age 34, heard the gunshot and ducked behind a counter when she saw Ramirez enter the kitchen. When she raised her head to look at what happened, he shot her once in the forehead, killing her instantly. Later that same night, he shot and killed yet another victim named Sai Lian Yu. And within an hour of the Hernandez home invasion, Ramirez pulled 30-year-old Yu out of her car in Monterey Park and shot her twice with a .22 caliber handgun and fled. So 2 murders, an attempted third in the single day attracted extensive coverage from news media, who dubbed the attacker, described as curly hair with bulging eyes and wide-spaced rotting teeth, the walk-in killer and the valley intruder. Over a week later, Ramirez murdered 64-year-old Vincent Zazzara and his 44-year-old wife, Maxine. It was then that Ramirez began to establish his signature attack style: shoot and kill the husband and then assault and stab the wife. Ramirez entered a home that he had burglarized a year earlier just outside of Whittier, California at approximately 2 a.m. and killed the sleeping Vincent Charles Zara with a gunshot to his head from a .22 caliber handgun. Zara's wife, Maxine, who was 44, was awakened by the gunshot, and Ramirez beat her and bound her hands while demanding to know where her valuables were. While he ransacked the room, Maxine escaped her bonds and retrieved a shotgun from under the bed, which was not loaded. This infuriated Ramirez, and he shot her 3 times with the .22 and then fetched a large carving knife from the kitchen. He mutilated her body by stabbing her several times, then removed her eyes with the knife and placed them in a jewelry box, which he took when he left and kept at his apartment as a souvenir until his arrest. The autopsies did determine that all the mutilations were done post-mortem.
Okay. Whew. Ouch.
Unfortunately, Vincent and Maxine's body were discovered by their son, Peter.
Oh.
Ramirez left footprints from a pair of Avia sneakers in the flower bed, which police photographed and cast, and this was virtually the only evidence that police had at the time. Bullets found at the scene were matched to those at previous attacks, and the police determined that a serial killer was at large. And for months, Ramirez would continue to stalk and murder more victims in California, striking fear in the hearts of people throughout the state. One of the most terrifying things about Ramirez is that he was willing to kill just about anyone who crossed his path. Unlike some serial killers who have a type, Richard Ramirez murdered both men and women and preyed on victims both young and old. On May 14, 1985, Ramirez returned to Monterey Park and entered the home of Bill Doy, age 66, and his disabled wife, Lillian, who was age 56. Surprising Doy in his bedroom, Ramirez shot him in the face with a .22 semi-automatic pistol as Doy went for his own handgun. After beating the mortally wounded man into consciousness, Ramirez entered Lillian's bedroom, bound her with thumb cuffs, and then raped her after he had ransacked the home for valuables. Bill died of his injuries while in the hospital. On the night of May 29, 1985, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Monrovia and stopped at the house of Mabel Bell, who was age 83, and her disabled sister, Florence Lang, who was age 81. He found a hammer in the kitchen. He bludgeoned and bound Lang in her bedroom, then bound and bludgeoned Bell before using an electrical cord to shock the woman. After raping Lang, he used Bell's lipstick to draw the satanic pentagram on her thigh as well as on the walls of both bedrooms. The women were found 2 days later alive but comatose and critically injured. Bell later died of her injuries at the hospital. The next day, Ramirez drove the same car to Burbank and sneaked into the home of Carol Kyle, age 42. At gunpoint, he bound Kyle and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs and then ransacked the house. He released Kyle to direct him where the family valuables were, and then he raped her repeatedly. Ramirez also repeatedly ordered her not to look at him, telling her at one point that he would cut her eyes out. He fled the scene after retrieving the child from the closet and binding the two together again with the handcuffs. On the night of July 2nd, 1985, he drove a stolen car to Arcadia and randomly selected the house of Mary Louise Cannon, age 85, who was a widowed grandmother. After quietly entering Cannon's home, he found her asleep in the bedroom. He bludgeoned her into unconsciousness with a lamp and then stabbed her to death using a 10-inch butcher knife from the kitchen. And Ramirez repeatedly stabbed Cannon's body after she was already dead, and she was found dead at the scene. 3 days later, on July 5th, Ramirez broke into a home in Sierra Madre and bludgeoned 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron as she slept in her bedroom.
My God, he is all over California.
Well, not only is he all over California, but he's all over with his MO.
Yeah.
He searched in vain for a knife in the kitchen. Ramirez tried to strangle the girl with a telephone cord. He stated that he was startled to see the electrical sparks emanate from the cord, and when her victim began to breathe, he fled the house believing that Jesus Christ had intervened and saved her. Bennett survived the savage beating and attempted strangulation, although 478 stitches were required to close the lacerations to her scalp.
Ow.
2 days later, on July 7th, Ramirez burglarized the home of Joyce Lucille Nelson, who was age 60, in Monterey Park. He found her asleep on the living room couch, and he beat her to death by stomping on her face repeatedly.
Goodness.
Police did get a shoe print from an Avia sneaker that was left imprinted on her face. And then
her face?
On her face, yep.
Ouch. Okay.
And after cruising 2 other neighborhoods, he returned to Monterey Park and chose the home of Sophie Dickman, age 63. Ramirez assaulted and handcuffed her at gunpoint, attempted to rape her, and stole her jewelry. And when she swore to him that he had taken everything of value, he told her to swear to Satan. On July 20th, 1985, Ramirez purchased a machete before driving a stolen Toyota to Glendale, California. And he chose the home of Leila Needing, age 66, and her husband Maxon, who was age 68. He burst into the couple's bedroom and hacked them with the machete, then killed them with the shots to the head from a .22 caliber handgun. He further mutilated their bodies with the machete before robbing the house of valuables. And after quickly fencing the stolen items from the Needing house, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley. Here at approximately 4:15 a.m., he broke into the home of the Covanth family. He shot the sleeping, I'm going to have a problem pronouncing this one, Chyanarong Covanth, in the head with a .25 caliber handgun, killing him instantly, and then repeatedly raped and beat Somkid Covanth. He bound the couple's 8-year-old son before driving Somkid around the house to reveal any location of valuable items which he stole. And during the assault, he demanded that she swear to Satan that she was not hiding any money from him. On July 6, 1985, Ramirez drove Northbridge and broke into the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson. He crept into the bedroom, startled Virginia, and shot her in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. He then shot Chris in the neck and attempted to flee, but Chris fought back while avoiding being hit by 2 more shots during the struggle before Ramirez managed to escape. This couple survived their injuries.
She got shot in the face and she survived?
Yes.
Wow.
2 days later, on August 8th, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Diamond Bar, California, and chose the home of Sakina Abuwath and her husband, Elias. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., he entered the house and went into the master bedroom. He instantly killed the sleeping Elias with a shot to the head from the .25 caliber handgun. He handcuffed and beat Sakina while forcing her to reveal the location of the family jewelry and then brutally raped her. He repeatedly demanded that she swear to Satan that she would not scream during the assaults. And when the couple's three-year-old son entered the bedroom, Ramirez tied the child up and continued to rape Sakina.
Oh, my God.
After Ramirez left the home, Sakina untied her son and sent him to the neighbors for help. At first, it seemed like Ramirez was only attacking people near Los Angeles, but soon he claimed a couple of victims near San Francisco as well. And since the press had dubbed him the Night Stalker, it was clear that most of his crimes happened at night, which was adding another scary element to his crimes. Ramirez had been following the media coverage of his crimes, and he left Los Angeles and headed to San Francisco. And on August 18th, 1985, he entered the home of Peter and Barbara Pan. He shot the sleeping Peter, who was age 66, in the temple with a .25 caliber handgun, which killed him instantly. And then he beat and sexually assaulted age 62 Barbara before shooting her in the head and leaving her for dead. At the crime scene, Ramirez used lipstick to scrawl a pentagram in the phrase "Jack the Knife" on the bedroom wall. And Ramirez again left a shoe print at the scene that detectives discovered and matched to a specific pair of Avia shoes that were not common at the time. Lead detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, who contributed to Netflix Night Stalker Hunt for a Serial Killer, contacted the manufacturer of Avia shoes and were able to retrieve the soles. Upon the discovery of the make and distribution across the United States, they found that only 6 of them existed that were size 11.5.
Huh.
With 5 of them that were shipped to Arizona and 1 shipped to a store in Los Angeles, it was evident that the 1 pair of its size and kind in the state of California then belonged to Ramirez. When it was discovered that the ballistics and the shoe print evidence from the Los Angeles crime scenes matched the Pan crime scene, San Francisco then Mayor Dianne Feinstein divulged the information, including the gun caliber, in a televised press conference. This leak infuriated the detectives in the case, as they knew the killer would be following the media coverage, and it gave him opportunity to destroy crucial forensics evidence. Ramirez, who had indeed been watching the press, dropped his size 11.5 Avia sneakers over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge that night, and he remained in the area a few more days before heading back to Los Angeles area. On August 24, 1985, Ramirez traveled 76 miles south of Los Angeles in a stolen orange Toyota to Mission Viejo. That night, he arrived at the home of James Ramirez Jr., who had just returned from a family vacation to Rosarito Beach in Mexico. Ramirez's 13-year-old son, James, happened to be awake. While his family was asleep, James went outside his house to retrieve a pillow inside the truck, which was locked, which is when he heard a rustling noise. Assuming it was an animal, James went to investigate the noise but did not notice anything unordinary. He then went to the garage to begin working on his mini bike before hearing Ramirez's footsteps outside the house. Thinking there was a prowler, James, after observing Ramirez through his bedroom window, went to wake his parents, and Ramirez fled the scene. James raced outside and noted the color, make, and style of the car, as well as a partial plate number, and Romero contacted the police with this information and believes James had chased away a thief. After this encounter, Ramirez broke into the house of Bill Carnes, age 30, and his fiancée Inez Erickson, age 29, through a back door. Ramirez entered the sleeping couple's bedroom and awakened Carnes, where he cocked his .25 caliber handgun. He shot Carnes 3 times in the head before turning his attention to Erickson. Ramirez told her that he was the Night Stalker and forced her to swear she loved Satan, as he beat her with his fist and bound her with neckties from the closet. After stealing what he could find, Ramirez dragged Erickson to another room before raping her. He then demanded cash and more jewelry and made her swear on Satan there was no more. Before leaving the house, Ramirez told Erickson, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Ramirez was able to untie herself after he left and went to a neighbor's house to get help for her severely injured fiancé. Surgeons removed 2 of the 3 bullets from his head, and he survived the injuries. Man, people that survived from headshots.
Yep.
All over California, people went to bed fearing that the Night Stalker would break into their homes while they slept and perform an unspeakable ritual of rape, torture, and murder. And since he apparently attacked at random, it truly seemed that no one was safe. The LAPD increased their presence on the street and even created a special task force just to find him, with the FBI lending a hand. Meanwhile, the public anxiety was so intense around this time, there was a noticeable surge in the sale of guns, lock installations, burglar alarms, and attack dogs. But ultimately, it was Richard Ramirez's own mistakes in August 1985 that led to his capture. After he was spotted outside a witness's home, he accidentally left a footprint behind, and he also left his car and license plate in plain sight. When the police tracked down the vehicle, they were able to find just enough of a fingerprint to make a match. At that point, they had already received tips that someone with the last name of Ramirez was involved. And sure enough, the LAPD was able to identify Richard Ramirez thanks to their new computer database of fingerprints. So there's kind of part of your answer right there. They didn't
have a database yet.
Yep. Even though the records only included criminals who were born after January 1960, it just so happened that Ramirez was born in February of 1960. Authorities soon found Ramirez's mugshots from his prior arrests, and one of his surviving victims came forward with a detailed description that was quite similar to the photos. By the end of August 1985, police decided to release the Night Stalker's image and name. Although they were initially worried this would give Ramirez a chance to escape, it turned out that he was blissfully unaware of his newfound publicity until it was too late. By pure happenstance, Richard Ramirez was traveling back to Los Angeles when his photo was released, so he didn't realize he had been tracked down until he was back in the city and saw his own face on the newspapers.
Yeah, he went into a convenience store and was like, "Oh, crap."
Mm-hmm. This was where he attempted to flee the police and tried to steal a car in the process, but he was tracked down by that vigilante mob that recognized him, and they beat him up until the police finally closed in. After his arrest, Ramirez was found guilty of 13 counts of murder. In addition to the murder charges, authorities also found him responsible for committing several rapes, assaults, and burglaries. Jury selection for the trial began on July 22nd, 1988, and at his first court appearance, Ramirez raised a hand with a pentagram drawn on it and yelled, "Hail Satan."
That is not helping his case.
No. And it's some very famous photos of him doing this as well.
Yeah, didn't he etch a pentagram into his forehead too? Or was it just his hands?
I don't remember if he did it on his forehead as well. It was definitely on his hands.
Yeah.
On August 3rd, 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees overheard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun, which Ramirez intended to have smuggled into the courtroom. Consequently, a metal detector was installed outside and intensive searches were conducted on people entering. On August 14th, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, did not arrive at the courtroom, and later that day she was found shot to death in her apartment. The jury was terrified, wondering if Ramirez had somehow directed this event from inside his prison cell, whether or not he could reach other jurors. However, it was ultimately determined that Ramirez was not responsible for Singletary's death, as she was shot and killed by her boyfriend, who later committed suicide with the same weapon in a hotel. The alternate juror who replaced Singletary was too frightened to even return to her home.
She just stayed over by the courthouse?
Yes. Ramirez was sentenced to death in the gas chamber for his crimes, and he smiled in response. The Night Stalker later said, "I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in us all." That's it. He was held in San Quentin State Prison for the rest of his life, but was never put to death. Due to the complicated nature of his case, which included a 50,000-page trial record, the state Supreme Court wasn't able to hear his appeal until 2006. And even though the court rejected his claims, additional appeals would have taken several more years. During this extended delay, Richard Ramirez met a female admirer named Doreen Loy, who had struck up a correspondence with him. And in 1986, he married her while on death row. She said 1 year later, "He's kind, he's funny, he's charming. I think he's really a great person. He's my best friend and he's my buddy." Weird.
Huh.
Obviously, most people did not share her feelings. For the countless Californians who lived in terror during the mid-1980s, Ramirez was little better than the devil that he worshipped. Peter Zazera, the son of victim Vincent Zazera, said, "It's just pure evil. It's just pure evil. I don't know why someone would want to do something like that, to take joy in the way it happened." Ultimately, Richard Ramirez died of complications from B-cell lymphoma, cancer of the lymphatic system, in 2019 at 53 years old. And while he was alive, the Night Stalker never expressed remorse for any of his crimes. In fact, he often appeared to take pleasure in his infamy. Shortly after getting his death sentence, he said, "Hey, big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." He was believed to have committed other murders and rapes, but was never charged for any additional crimes. And that is the story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Wow. That was wild.
Yeah, pretty brutal dude. And I kind of say he probably got his justice.
Yeah. Yeah, that evil's got to go somewhere. And hey, evil's got to go somewhere. And cancer, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people who get cancer and aren't evil. So maybe I'm just talking out my butt.
Yeah, maybe so at that point. I would think so. Well, that takes us to the end of another week. Hopefully you learned something today. You can find all of our information at nerdarymurdery.com, where you can get more information about our show. You can find the links to everything we talked about, as well as pictures and videos.
Yes, we have a YouTube channel as well, where we've got a bunch of videos and links, as well as some stuff that we like and think is funny. Nerdy and Murdery YouTube page.
Yes, thank you for that. You can also find our merchandise on our link on our webpage, where if you wish to show off your Nerd and Murdery fandom, please do consider doing that. It goes to help support the show, as well as a link to our Patreon. Again, we appreciate each and every one of our patrons that does go to help us with production costs. As it does cost to do this show, we don't use it to buy our Lamborghinis.
No, we do not. Please and thank you.
Please and thank you. And last but not least, please don't forget to leave a 5-star review wherever you can. It really helps us and helps others find our content that may be looking for content like we're putting out. So with that,
I have been Zig with your nerdery.
And I'm Geoffrey with your murdery.
Cue the music.